Thank you. The big issue of food sustainability is, well, sustainability in food is a huge thing, and actually all processed things at the moment, particularly in vertical farming. It's an issue we've come up against on the work we've done at the Institute here with vertical farming, and having to justify it compared to other production systems. But actually sustainability full stop in our food has become a huge issue, I think, as I've said. So we'd like to hear more about it and how we mine into that. And luckily, we've got a clear expert in the area. So we've got Michael Martin here, and Michael is a senior researcher and professor of sustainable production and consumption at the IVL Swedish Environment Research Institute, and his chair is in KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. So Michael's going to tell us about what LCA is, because some people do think it's a black box. It's not, it's hugely important, and it's actually driving a huge amount of investment into everything now. If you can't calculate sustainability, very often in the commercial world, you will not get investment to boost your idea and your products and processes. So LCA is really coming up fast on the agenda as being able to measure sustainability. So enough of me talking far too much. I'm going to hand you over to Martin. He's going to talk about conducting LCA with vertical farms. Michael. Thank you, Michael. It's over to you.
Thank you. Let's see here. There. So I titled my my talk "The Life Cycle Assessment of Vertical Farms and Insights into What, Why, and How," and that's of LCA. So I had a great introduction, but I would also like to say that I work. I don't only work with vertical farming. I work a lot with like industrial and urban symbiosis systems. So how we can connect these different industries, and also looking into procurement and life cycle sustainability assessment. But what I'll focus on today is a bit more the environmental side, the environmental life cycle assessment. And maybe to give you some insights, because it's maybe quite a different market, and we don't maybe know much from Sweden. So some insights about what is happening in Sweden right now. To start out, so there's vertical farms of varying size and applications in Sweden, and we have a list and different things of the different types of farms, but there's only a few large farms in Sweden right now. The biggest being, for example, like Ljusgårda, Vaxa, Nära Sverige, and Oh My Greens. And these are like bigger farms that kind of produce products that are sold in supermarkets around the country. But a lot of them are these kind of small and mid-sized farms. So we have like Farmy and Sweetgreen and Nordermark, but we also have a lot of these, maybe it's similar there, but we have a lot of these modular and container farms, and these are like distributed around the country. So we see like they're popping up quite a lot. So we see in-store and restaurant systems, which are growing quite a lot in Sweden in particular right now. Container farms as well, they're being like put up. There's a lot of them now in Stockholm, maybe 10. And then we see some expanding systems, some new things that are coming out based on some more simple approaches. And one is the green city farming in Gothenburg. But also there's systems being developed for not only plants, but for example, mushrooms. So mushrooms and insect farm, we see a lot of development. But again, the products are typically the right now are the leafy greens, herbs, microgreens, and I would say the edible flowers are becoming a big hit right now. And these are just some pictures from the farms. Like this is one of the microgreen farms, a container farm. Here's the container farms at IKEA. Here's one of the bigger ones, Ljusgårda in the middle of Sweden. And then that brings me to this question. So we heard from the introduction that it's important, and this is the question that I always get. So I've been doing sustainability assessments with lots of different types of food systems, but since about 2016 with vertical farms. And often I get asked, are they sustainable? So this is the question that's always coming up. And then what we wanted to do is like see like what is it actually, before we always come to our conclusion, because we're researchers, we like to understand what do people say. And we did a study on the narratives that are actually out there. So we studied, for example, websites of the companies, and we also looked into the literature and for example, the newspaper articles, what is written about them, what do journalists say? And oftentimes we hear the same things like they're sustainable and they can provide self-sufficiency in urban areas, reduce transportation and water consumption, improve yields, resource efficient methods, they can shorten supply chains, they have a large potential for expansion, and sometimes even saying there's no greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And this leads to a lot of criticism of the systems because sometimes the claims are a bit unfounded. So we need to think about these before you say them. And for example, that it's going to become more important, which I'll get back to. And I would say that we don't know that much about the sustainability of vertical farms because there is very few real case study like data that's available. There's very few articles available, and they tend to focus on potential. So maybe theoretical studies of what could be done or like comparisons between countries. These are really nice articles like in Nature and stuff, but they don't provide empirical data. There's also divergent system scopes, so we can't always compare studies because they have a different scope of what they look at. And then when we talk to companies, although we've been fortunate to be able to work with companies and publish information, but when we talk with companies, what they often say is that they're a bit scared sometimes of actually publishing LCAs because they don't want to be the first in their area or in their country because there's no real standard assessment, and then basically people can use that information to try to make the next one look better. So they're a bit scared of being the first, but also that it's mostly based on carbon assessments as well, and there's few other indicators that are looked at, and that's where we can get into how we can use LCA a bit further. So then what is it? So that's often what people ask me as well. What can I do with LCA? People know a lot about carbon footprints and carbon assessments, and it's basically if you know that, you know how LCA works. Well, it's a standard procedure to assess the environmental performance, and that's of products or services. So in this case, with vertical farms, we could look at a service or, for example, the product that's coming out. And what we typically say is that we can look from the cradle to grave. So along the entire, that's why it's called the life cycle, cradle to grave of the system. And in food systems, we can also break this down into, for example, farm to gate or farm to fork that you've probably heard about in different policy documents, etc. Its life cycle assessment has an ISO standard, and there's all types of European and national LCA based on the ISO standards, and it's not anything new. So it's been around since the 1960s, actually. So if you look at the literature, what we find is that, for example, Coca-Cola was one of the first companies to do LCA when they wanted to understand, should we use plastic or glass bottles, just to see the impacts of, for example, the transportation of the different bottling systems. And that's kind of how it started, the assessment methods. And this is what it typically includes. So if we start at the top and go around in a circle, we start with the resources. So the cradle is basically, we need to take resources. We need to take those resources and then bring them to a production or manufacturing site that produces a product, which often requires packaging for the product to be sent through the distribution to the end user, which then uses the product. In the case of food, you eat it. And then there's often, for example, the recycling, or if there's something left over, in the case of a plant, it could be the plot with soil or different things that needs to go somewhere. So we can talk about the recycling or end of life of that product. And hopefully it's somehow recycled back in and we can use parts of it again and again. So this is what we think about when we have the life cycle of the products. And why do we do it? It's a good question. And then as researchers, we tackle a question with more questions. We say, so people ask, why should I do LCA? And I would say, like, you need to answer some questions on why you should do LCA. So if you just want to do an LCA just to do an LCA, that's not a good approach, I would say. But you should typically do LCA to understand where do the impacts occur in your life cycle along this production system. And then if you understand where those are, for example, you can see how the main question, how can we reduce or improve these? That's where it gives you these like hotspots, and you can look into what can we do different. So this what is then important. So then you can think, are there materials, utilities, systems, technologies that can be used to reduce the impacts here? And then an important question that's often left out is who, because you need to understand you can't often do these alone. You need to understand who can support you in this transition, because there's probably technologies and things out there that can help you. So if you identify the hotspots, you can identify opportunities for improvements, and then you can use this information to maybe even make scenarios and test the implications and changes, and that helps you for decision making to improve your system or go further. And I would say also this why to do an LCA is also because, as we heard in the introduction, there's lots of people are asking for it. It's gone from this voluntary. LCA was kind of designed for voluntary purposes for companies to help themselves improve, but now it's becoming, I would say, necessary. And that's because we get this external pressure on communication and reporting. People want to know, they want to see the transparency of your products or systems. That's becoming increasingly important in society. Also in business, you have to link to these like ESGs and the greenhouse gas protocol reporting. In the EU, for example, it's really important now that there's the EU green claims legislation. So if you want to talk about how sustainable your product is, you really can't do that without the backing of an LCA. And they're also promoting the product environmental footprint initiative, which should have LCAs for basically all products. But it's also becoming increasingly interesting for example, procurement, for like product portfolios for supermarkets, and even for public procurement for schools, for example, for food. And again, yeah, the retailers are requiring sometimes. We have a retailer called Coop, and they're really asking for the sustainability information from companies to be able to be in their portfolio. So there's a very large interest or requirement for environmental sustainability information in society right now, and I would say that's really important also for vertical farms. And again, this is being asked by lots of people. As you said in the intro, the investors are very much asking for this information. And I would say it has cooled down quite a bit this last year. But I was called almost every week or month by investors who were investing in vertical farming projects. And they would ask me always, like, are vertical farms sustainable? Is this sustainable, and should we invest in this? And I'll get back to that later, but I got the same question all the time. But also consumers even would write emails because maybe they've seen I've been on a news report, and they would ask me, are these sustainable? Should we eat these? Are these dangerous, or are these poisonous for me? Things like this. And retailers want to know because they have like carbon assessment methods and carbon footprinting apps and things, and they want this information. But also, luckily, I would say luckily, the biggest push that I've seen is actually from companies who are actually interested in working with LCA. So we would say that we would call that like an internal driver for LCA, and they want to know, how can we improve? So they've come to me to ask, like, we want to develop strategies, we want to know where are our impacts, how can we improve, what new materials should we use, and basically what would happen if we did this, and that's really fun to do research about that, not just provide a number, but provide information on what could be done. And back to what I said about the investors, and even the retailers and others. So often I get the question if vertical farms are sustainable, and I often ask them, but what are you comparing to? And they say, oh, but conventional products. And then I ask them, what conventional products? What are the ones you're comparing to? And then I said, do you know how sustainable those are? And they say no. And I say, then how can you compare? So we also say, like, where are the conventional production LCAs? Because there's very little data on those as well. So what we see is that vertical farms are being asked to assess how sustainable they are, but not conventional production. And then we don't have much to compare with. Or we have like database data that we can use, which is typically old, or it's based on like a European average or something. So we don't have that much to compare to. That's the gist of it. It's really important to expand, for example, the case studies that are available for LCAs of vertical farms. In the CEA world, we have a lot of studies about lettuce and often tomatoes. There's lots of studies about tomatoes, but we don't see much, for example, about other crops like kale and herbs and things that are very prevalent in vertical farms. And there's very limited data in the databases, like the lifecycle inventory databases. So it's nice to have a comparative bank and see like studies coming out from different countries to address like what is going on and how much impact do they have and how is that context dependent. So how do you do it? This is the fun part, and I would say that it's not that difficult to do an LCA, but you kind of need to know what others have done, and then you need to understand kind of the steps on what's involved. And this is a basic overview of how you do it. So how you do it is, these are the main steps. You try and determine the goal and scope. Basically, what do you want to do? You collect appropriate data for your system, compile all the data that you have for how you produce, link it to inventory data that's in the databases, or if you find some online, you calculate the impacts, and then you review and revise. You understand like what you interpret it, and what do we do here? And is there any problems compared to other systems? And then basically you can report or use that information for internal improvements. This is what we typically see when the reports for LCAs, and it's this these arrows that go between like the goal and scope, inventory, impact analysis, and interpretation. In the interpretation on the right, there's back and forth arrows because it's very iterative. You never can do an LCA perfect from the beginning. You're always going to find that there can be a human error, or that there's some process that you need to review further. Oftentimes in the LCAs for vertical farms, I see that like energy and water consumption are often not that well documented. So you need to go back and see, like, do a sanity check. Basically, is this right or not? One thing that's important is also to link it. What is it that you want to have the impacts for? And that's what we call the functional unit in an LCA. And what we say is that it's in the ISO standard, it says that it's a quantitative measure of the function provided by the product or service. So what is the function of the product that you have coming out? Oftentimes for food, what we do is we use kilograms. So kilograms of a product is the function unit, and that's the most common. So that's the thing that people use the most. We've seen things like the impact of like a basket of products, or if you sell like a potted plant, it could be one potted plant. You could do it per package, like a 60-gram package, etc., or even an annual production if you're just interested in looking at your system, so you don't look at the individual products. So you really need to think about what it is you're doing. Oftentimes when we do the LCAs of the vertical farms, we look at for example, a yearly production of the system, and then then the function unit is easy. We just divide by, for example, the number of plants or kilos, and then we get per kilo or per plant. So again, this is because oftentimes your product is not sold as a kilo bag. It's like a 60-gram or 50-gram bag, something like that. So you need to think about, is that the function unit that you have? And this is another example, like this is very common in Sweden, at least, that you sell herbs as potted plants because people like to have them like on their counter in the kitchen. And that could be the thing, because this is probably only 40 grams or less of basil. The fun part is then to think about the system and what you need to collect data for. And this is often what we call like defining the system boundaries and what's included or not. And you have your system in the middle, and you basically need to understand what is that made of, what is the infrastructure, and for example, what is the lifetime of that? The steel structures, the LEDs, the steel structures can be there for quite a long time, but the LEDs might need to be changed every 5 to 10 years. So you need to think about that. What type of energy inputs do we need? Is it heat? Is it electricity? Or the different processes? And what are the material inputs that we have for basically producing the plants? And then we need also material for harvesting or for packaging. And then we need transportation and basically all the processes go out to the end user. And we have waste in all of the parts of the process, and how do we include those? Often when we do the LCAs, the main process that's the largest impacting process is the energy consumption. So often it's the electricity. From what you see like in the picture here, it's electricity for basically the lighting and the ventilation. Those are the largest impacting processes. Then we can also see that depending on the structures, it could be the infrastructure and machinery that you have. For example, if you have a lot of automation and different things, also logistics can play a role if you send the products around the country. And even if you use like recyclable packaging that can go back and forth to the farm, or if you use cardboard boxes to send all your products, that could be a large impacting process. Growing media can be big, depends on how you account for it, and even fertilizers and waste handling. Those aren't typically that big, but it can be important in your system as well. When we do the LCA, the thing that takes the longest. So as I said, the LCA is not that difficult. You just basically link numbers, but it's the numbers that you try to get from the companies that is difficult. So this takes the most time, and I would say collecting the data is hard because you kind of know what you want, but sometimes it's hard to communicate with the companies. When we ask them for certain data, they always say that they have all the data. We have all the data, we can provide you all the data. But then when you show them like, we need this data, they don't have that data. They might have other data or in different forms. So you need to have like a dialogue with them about what type of data you need. And then sometimes you need to make assumptions on processes and materials if that's not available. And again, do this like sanity check with them to understand like, is this okay? Is this right or wrong? But again, like there's a lot of hunting the data from the companies. And I would say it's important if you do an LCA to try and get someone to be like a data responsible internally, maybe in the different parts of the farm or something to get you the right data. Because if you rely on just one person, it's hard for them to get data from everyone. And then you need to think about how much data do we need actually. And that's where a seasoned LCA practitioner will know how much you need, because you can provide a lot, but in the end, you don't need that much granularity to do the LCA, because you know that certain processes will be largely affecting or not. So small, tiny things in the system won't have a big impact. And then what you do is you create like the inputs and output table of the system, and you link to life cycle inventory data. In here, I would say this is important. You try to get the best data that you can, and the best data is usually you have to pay for it. So like EcoInvent, Sfera, there's some good data on OpenLCA, even though it's free. But there's also data available, and sometimes on like if you just Google data, for carbon assessments. But if it's free data, sometimes it's not good quality because you can't check on the reliability, or you don't know when it was last updated, etc. So use scientific articles or inventory data if possible. And what you do then is you link it to you link like the impacts to your environmental or your inputs and outputs, and that kind of looks like this. This is just an example, like if we have a process that uses 5 kilowatts of energy, and in the Swedish system, energy system, electricity has, for example, 44 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. So we would just multiply 5 by 44. And then we get the impacts from our electricity. If we use 0.5 of an unspecified fertilizer, and if it has 1 kilo per kilogram of fertilizer, you get 0.5, and 1 liter of water has 0.2 kilograms carbon dioxide per liter, and then we basically just add them up. So a lot of people ask me like, oh, do you have to know a lot of math to do LCA? No, it's addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. You don't need to do that much, but in Excel or in the programs, it's basically just this matrix algebra, multiplication, etc. And then what we get from the LCA, often people have heard of carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gases or carbon footprints, and that's one of the main outputs because people understand that, and that's what we often see. But in the life cycle impact assessment methods, we have usually 10 to 20 impact categories, and these can be important to look at because they can provide the life cycle land use, the life cycle water use from different processes. You can link biodiversity, acidification, eutrophication, toxicity, resource depletion, and these are quite context dependent. So in Europe, we have LCIA methods for like European systems, but in certain countries they have their own. So like in the US, they have the Tracy method. In Europe, we have the environmental footprint version, like the latest is version 3.1, and those are more like regionally specific. But also there's Asian and there's other impact methods that can be used in other areas. And when you do this, it's important because when you design your processes to improve, oftentimes companies want to try to improve carbon dioxide emissions, but that could also lead to trade-offs. So if you reduce carbon dioxide emissions by adding lots of technology, you could see that could also lead to resource depletion or even biodiversity damage in other areas of the world. I need to think like, what do we want to do here? What is important for our process? So basically, it comes down to your choices. You need to motivate them if you show them in your study. But I also wanted to say that it's important that some of the impact categories are less robust. So if you look at the literature, like the toxicity assessments, etc., they're still being discussed in the field. So some of them are, you maybe could avoid them. And then what you do is you report. So when you're done, you get back the information. You've gone through all these iterations. Like I said, you've done these sanity checks, you've looked, you've maybe compared to other studies to see is my study reasonable? And you could also do a third-party check. And then you can report like where along the life cycle do the impacts occur? How do we improve them? I think that's important if you do a study, not just show, okay, we have a large impact assessment from energy. But like you could say, okay, we could look into this. What could we do better? Use that information. Then like, are there any trade-offs? And if you can compare to other systems, what can you say about your system? Is it larger or smaller, and why? And what can you actually compare with those systems? And then when you want to communicate, if you do want to communicate, like what can you say? And what can you communicate? And I think that's also important because again, of these like green claims directives, etc. What is it that you're allowed to say, or what can you do on your packaging, etc. And these, if you want to do that, then the results should definitely be transparent and validated. You should either do it academically and scientifically reviewed, or like a third-party review. So if you do, for example, ISO or EPDs or different things, you can get them third-party verified before you make communication about your impacts. And then how could it be used? These are just some results from some of the studies we've done, just to give you an example from Sweden. So here again is Djurgården, and this is one of the bigger farms, and we did a big study with them. And we showed, for example, in their system, these are different impact categories. If you look, the energy, or it's basically all electricity, it is the largest impacting process for basically all environmental impact categories. So greenhouse gas emissions and land use and resources, etc. And then you can see like others that can be important are like the consumables and fertilizers and even the transportation out to the consumer. So then you can see like what you can use this information to see like, okay, where can we improve these, and what can we do further. Then what we did in this case is we tried to find the data that was available for conventional systems and show where does their product stand compared to the conventional varieties that are available in the supermarket. So we looked at statistics to see where do the actual, in this case they sell packaged lettuce, and then we saw where does packaged lettuce come from, and we worked with a lettuce or like a salad bag provider. And we found the countries and the production processes where they come from. We tried to look into for example, the waste that was produced along the supply chain. And then we made comparisons with the conventional, imported, and domestic production. And we showed that the vertical farm is pretty good compared to the others. And then they used this information on their packaging to say that, for example, that it could have 50% reduced emissions. And this is good, but at the same time, be careful, like when you do these type of like claims and things, or have information to back it up. And in this case, they have like a tag, and you can go, and it takes you directly to the environmental study that we did. So, and in another case, this wasn't communicated, but it was more, we did the quintessential Swedish system. We looked at lettuce production at IKEA. So they had these containers, and what they wanted to show was they wanted to look into the environmental impacts from producing lettuce on site versus importing lettuce from abroad. So we did an assessment, and we have a lot of data on the background of this, but one thing that was important for them to show to their to the heads of IKEA of the system was that how much impact does this have, and what is it? Yeah, what is it compared to for like conventional products? And we did this during the year because we got all the information from the IKEA cafeteria to see where does the lettuce come from, where do they source from at different times of the year, and then we could basically compare and show that the impact was so the baseline and the baseline renewable mix are the vertical farm, and the vertical farm is basically pretty good as well, except in like the summer months when they could get it from Swedish like greenhouses or open fields, and it was close produced, so it makes sense to run the vertical farm in the other months, but maybe not June and July, for example. And then that's the information that we gave them. And we've done a lot of other systems, like other containers and other farms, and these modular, like in-store farms, etc. And they are all around about the same value. But I would say that there are some challenges doing the LCA. So the most, I would say, since I started in around 2015, 2016 to do these LCAs of these systems, one thing that you see is that it's basically because of the industry is constantly emerging and evolving, and all of these farms that we've worked with has changed so much over the years that we've worked with them. So if we've done an LCA like in 2016, the company have either like pivoted and changed their business model or the way that they produce or what they do, or that they've improved significantly over the time. And I think that's also very interesting to look at, like what have they done during the period and why has it improved? And that's often not shown in these assessments and these things about vertical farms, where they just talk about, sometimes you see in the literature and the news that they're bad or that they have large resource consumption. But I think it's important to show also the improvements that have been made over time. So do we take, for example, a snapshot, or do we show this like changes over time, or a perspective study of the future, with what we have now, and do we look at what could be done in the future if we change or if we improve? Also the energy demand is something that's typically, it's difficult to get information about. I come back to that later in the presentation when I talk you. I think you should definitely take data there, so meter where you can for the LEDs and the ventilation specifically, because those can be improved, and that done by changing like timing, photo period, dynamic lighting possibilities, and then also what is it that we look at. So that's also a challenge, as I talked about with this functional unit. Is it the kilos? Is it the annual production? But also oftentimes what people say is that the vertical farmed products are better or have better quality than the imported varieties because they're fresh, they're locally produced. But how do we do that? How can we show that? So can we, for example, use nutrition or quality to be able to show the differences? Because if we just use kilograms, it could be a kilogram of a very nice product versus a kilogram of a not so nice product. And how do we show that difference? Also, when you a lot of farms are very interested in like the packaging, but that can also be difficult because oftentimes people make assumptions that paper is better than plastic, but that's also you also need to understand how does that affect the shelf life and quality of the product, or even the visibility and the willingness to pay for the product, because it depends on the markets, and then how it is in the area that you're at. Is there an end-of-life treatment for that type of paper or plastic or that type of material that you use in your packaging? Because that can make a big difference in the LCA, if it's able to be recycled or not. Even if you say it's a recycled product, does your area have a recycling facility for that type of product or sorting system? Also, the LCI data can be limited for the system, so you need to make some assumptions, but these are improving over time. Like I said, if you pay for the good LCI databases, you get improved models and different things over time. And I would say that it's important also to show more than carbon dioxide emissions. But this is a challenge because there are a lot of the studies that have been done just show carbon dioxide emissions. So when you try to compare other impact categories, it's difficult because we don't have numbers to compare to. But then another thing that could be influential for your system as well is, do you connect to other systems? So for example, vertical farms produce a lot of heat, and can that heat be used in another system? If that heat is used in another system, you could get a credit for that because that other system avoids purchasing another heat, and this allocation in credits could be important for your farm. If you use waste products, or if you recycle, or if you, for example, if you upcycle like your peat or coconut coir, something that you use as a growing media or something else at the end, that can also be important in your system, and that should be taken into account. And my tips then for doing the LCA is to start collecting data early, and also the right data, which I'll give some input there, just to understand like what is it that you need. So one thing that's good is metering. Again, like install if you can. I don't think it's that difficult. install a meter for the lights and the ventilation, just to understand how much is it using and when, because there's a lot that can be done there to improve the impact of the system and even the cost. And don't see it as a chore, because I think it's, as I said, it's going to start becoming mandatory. So you should see this as like an opportunity to start collecting data and make your life easier when you're asked to do an LCA. And just understand that it takes some time and iterations. So sometimes it's frustrating, but it's also fun to learn about the system and understand what you can do. And if you work with the right people, it could be an enjoyable experience. And I would also say that this is what I often say to students when I teach, because I say once you learn about how the LCAs are done and how the limitations and the possibilities for them, you can be critical as well of what's being, like the claims that are being made in the industry. And you can look at other LCAs and understand more about them and be critical and understand what can be done further. And one thing I think is interesting that could be used by others is we have an open access chapter here where we basically provide guidance on how LCAs can be done for vertical farms. And there we give a very basic like input and output table that shows you what you could collect, gives some methodological guidance, talks about important processes and steps in the process, what you should think about, when you choose the electricity system, how to define the system boundaries, and just some general tips and some comparative numbers, etc. So I would say this is an interesting chapter. And with that, I think I'll end, and then I guess I can take some questions as well.
Oh, thanks very much for that, Michael. I think you've demystified LCA well, but actually one of my take-home points is actually it is pronounced IKEA and not IKEA, as we are told on the sales pitch in the UK at the moment. So maybe I'm wrong. So you've generated a lot of questions. I've got lots myself, but I'll go to the chat first. Actually, if they want to talk, ask the questions themselves. Ian, do you want to ask your questions? If you're on microphone, or do you want me to do it?
I can do that, Derek. That's absolutely fine. I'll start my video.
Go ahead, Ian.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that, Martin. It was really useful, really interesting. So I had a couple of questions in here, but the first one really was about the quality of the data that you're getting from some of the data sets, so for EcoInvent. And it's very much a loaded question, because I've looked at this for the chemical sector and the data is appalling, really, really bad and really badly averaged and very, very difficult to use. So you're using a global number or a European number for something which when you really want the data from an individual factory. And I wondered if you could comment on what you think the quality of the data is that you have to work with at the moment.
Yeah, I think you're right. So although it is updated and it's the best that's available, it is not often the best thing to use. So you can make your own mini LCAs of other systems if you want to be a bit more specific. So for example, if you know that you want to do like an LCA of like your seeding machine, you could just choose like large machinery as the inventory data in like EcoInvent or something. But if you look into that, that might not be the right data set for your system. And you could model the seeding machine exactly how it is. Basically, what are all the individual parts, and either build up your own or base it on materials, and then even compare. So I would say that that's the best way to go. The best thing is if you have specific data. In the best case, all of the providers of like the machinery and all of the inputs would all have LCAs that you could use to then do your LCA. Yeah. But that's not the way that it is, unfortunately, right now.
I would tend to agree as well, to go back to the point you made, Michael, earlier about you go to industry and they say, yeah, we've got all the data for that LCA, and you say, well, yeah, well, that what you provide is fantastic. What about this piece? Well, we don't measure that. It's the palm moment there. And I think, it can only get better as they realise what they need to measure, I think.
Yeah.
So, Carlotto, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, well, along the same discussion, every vertical farm I've seen until now is different. So collecting data, well, seeding machine might be able to get from a commercial company who produced them, but I have a feeling that everybody is doing their own solution. And when you can then compare it to a greenhouse, a modern greenhouse, then you actually have quite a standard in how you manage the aspects. And when we have a EU project where we are trying to look at like LCAs for another crop, and the challenge is that the database information for, say, let's say chickpea for Italy and Denmark and Sweden and Ireland, there's only one value. So how do you handle in your analysis, because the data are so crude?
Yeah, that's when you don't have good data quality, the LCAs, you can also incorporate that. So you can have a data quality index, and you can have that included in your study. Then you can use Monte Carlo assessments, and you can also even do, for example, sensitivity. If you know that this data set is not that good of quality, you can compare it to other ones with more specific data and see the influence that it could have. So we often can find some data that's available in the country, but it might be only for like one impact category, like carbon dioxide assessments. And we can compare that to like the eco-invent data. And sometimes we see that it's wildly different. And I think that's important to show. And that's what we state like in this chapter that I talk about with, for example, the electricity data is very like widely different in like the regional like the reports that the electricity companies give, and then like an eco-invent and others, and it's nice to show the difference there as well, because that can.
On top, it's dynamic because the composition of energy, like in Sweden, you have more water, a little nuclear power. In Denmark, we have 50% sustainable energy supplies, but nuclear power. So it's a kind of very dynamic process.
Yeah.
That's worse in Scotland, because in Scotland we don't actually have our own data. We only have UK data, and yet Scotland's probably more than self-sufficient in renewables, but we have to average our data with that in England, and a lot of that comes from fossil. So actually we're in a bad position. We can't actually demonstrate very easily how much better it would be to do in Scotland rather than to do that in England. I'm not arguing for independence. No. I'm just, I'm arguing for better quality data rather than a political solution there.
It kind of feeds back to producing the produce. If sustainability is going to become a factor in investment, will this become a factor in deciding where the geolocation of the production company goes now? Because as you just said, Ian, we're sometimes we're tipping 99% renewables theoretically. Whereas if you went to, I don't know, pick a bad one, Singapore, which is coal and oil fired, they're having real problems there. So exactly the same system, exactly the same process, your data will be night and day, just on sustainability or emissions criteria.
Even in Sweden, in the north of Sweden, it's mostly hydropower. And then if we go towards the south, so we have 4 different markets. And there it's a lot more based on coal and imports from Germany, etc. So but we use often average data, like an average Swedish mix. And that's why I always say, like, the companies will often want to use, they say they purchase renewable energy, but always it's nice to show the average data and then a few other impact or electricity mixes to be able to show the difference.
Catherine, do you want to ask your question? If you're there.
Apologies for not putting on the video, my bandwidth is playing up.
Sorry?
So it's sort of a bit of a composite. One was, you mentioned CO2, but it strikes me that is that the only thing you take into account? I don't know, for instance, where you might be taking scarce resources, or sort of where water availability might be an issue or something like that. And the other thing was sort of in the same tone, not just in terms of what you're measuring as an input, but what you're measuring as an output. Kind of noted you were talking about in some ways just volume of what you do, but as I understand it, vertical farming tends to be about things with high nutritional value. And is there any way of actually measuring impact per nutritional value, because the point of the sort of controlled environment is you have better control over that.
Yeah, so the first one is definitely we look at other things beside greenhouse gas emissions. So all of the databases can provide lots of different impact categories. So we can look into like the resource depletion for all of the processes along the life cycle. And that's what I mean with the studies that a lot of the studies we see typically only provide greenhouse gas emissions. And then I think that should be improved, and you should show others to be able to understand like what trade-offs there are and what other effects do we have from this system that we're looking at. And then the second question related to nutritional, if like the basing the function unit on quality and nutritional aspects, definitely. I think it's like there has been studies that have been done. So we see there hasn't been much done for, I would say, the like vertical farms or like even CEA products like greenhouses, others. I've seen some things have been done on tomatoes. So like they've used like bricks and different quality measures to compare the different production outputs. But we see similar things in like so if you know like meat versus meat alternatives, there you also have the same thing where they try to compare kilos versus kilos, or like one burger versus one burger, but they have like different amino acid compositions. So they base it on like a quantity of amino acids, and milk even has the same thing. So milk has its own function unit based on nutrition. So there's quality that's included there. But for vertical farms, etc., I think that those could be that could be something that should be done, because we could see that like secondary metabolites or vitamins or different things could actually be improved in vertical farms. But when we do the assessments with like when I did the comparisons with like one of the big farms, we did look into what could be delivered from the system. So the vertical farms would typically produce 1 kilo, and most of that kilo would end up to this end user. But from conventional systems, at least for like importing to Sweden, a lot of that is lost. So we would see large losses along the supply chain, like 30% losses just in the packaging system where they cut it and they package it. So there you also have a quality issue. So like 1 kilo is not comparing to 1 kilo. 1 kilo vertical farm produce is like comparing to maybe 2 kilos of a conventional product. So there it's not necessarily quality, but we kind of take it into account.
I mean, you've got multiple different criteria you can slice and dice the same data on. I mean, the argument, I think, Carl, I think you probably got a comment on this as well. The extension of shelf life is a unit that vertical farming claims. So your kilograms per day per usability, or there's different ways to slice that. And I think a lot of it can be derived from exactly the same data as is being collected. I mean, I know we're doing stuff now looking at vertical farming and potential protein content, or I know Francis has got a comment there. We're talking not just vertical farming, but looking at protein and feed is not just good enough. It's digestible protein, it has to be then. And it becomes more and more finessed. Sometimes it's almost, you feel as people are looking for a yes comment for what they want rather than just the gross value. Carol, you had something to add?
Yep. Well, I'm not part one. I'm not sure there's so much nutritional components in the small green things that we produce in greenhouses for the time being. But once we move up to produce protein crops, might be relevant. But the biggest challenge right now, if we compare it to import from Spain, like in Denmark, if you compare it to production in a model greenhouse, literally next to the vertical farm, and if you ship it through the major chains like Coop in Sweden and Denmark, well, the transport distance will be the same because you move to the hubs and then you move out to the shops.
Yeah.
So you will still use, if we talk about CO2 equivalents, you will use more energy for the vertical farms and you will have the same quality as such. In northern Sweden, there's a small nursery who's delivering more or less from Umeå to most of northern Sweden. So their transport footprint is enormous.
Yeah.
but there's no other solution.
Okay. Right, so it's jump tack. Francis, do you want to ask yours?
Yes, great presentation, by the way, really enjoyed it. So I'm just kind of wondering, I realize there's a lot of variation between farms, but I'm wondering if you've been aware of any generalizations in terms of setup. So like aeroponics versus hydroponics, how they are kind of looking in relation to efficiency and impacts.
Yeah, I think what we see is so I haven't looked at the like LCAs of those systems, but I know like resource efficiency is different for them. So water use efficiency is different. But then otherwise we haven't noted that much. We haven't been able to compare too many types of systems. But I would say that the KPIs can be different and you need to be aware of those because they can be about square meters. But if you grow like horizontally versus vertically, that it's a bit different. So I think there, yeah, it's you have to think about that as well. And some systems might use a lot more metal versus plastics, and there you can see differences in the infrastructure. But I would say most of the differences that we see are, I would say it's basically just based on the context. So we can see like the same like container farm study that's been done in like the UK versus Sweden, and then the impacts are quite the same for infrastructure if we do the LCA similarly, but the impacts in the end are different because of the energy system. I would say that's one of the most important points in the LCAs for vertical farms.
Okay. The interesting point I think that probably most weren't aware of is the different categories you can build into NCAs and report on. I mean, most people would tend to think of CO2 equivalents, but I think it was just a single comment that kind of put a bit of fear into me that there was almost for some of these other categories, everyone's got their own method or standards that they're working to, and that kind of really worries me. We have no unification of standards, so interoperability and reporting of data will be problematic then.
Yeah, there is like standards being developed. So I know that there's the CEA Footprint initiative from the US that they've been doing with a lot of companies around the world to understand like how do we do this and how do we compare KPIs for CEA. So it's not only vertical farms, but also greenhouses and other systems. And there you can see it gives you some kind of idea of where do you stand. Mm-hmm. But it tries to help like understand what you should look at. But then it doesn't give you like the what we call in LCA the product category rules, the PCRs, like in an EPD or a PEF, like how you should do it. And maybe we'll see like in the near future an EPD or a PEF category rule for vertical farms, and then that will provide like standard on how to assess. Mm-hmm. The Association for Vertical Farming also has some kind of sustainability standardization thing that they do, but it's not that not specifically for LCA. Mm-hmm. So I would say in the meantime, it's important to show to try and do it the scope. That's why we tried to give this chapter just to give some guidance, because a lot of companies have asked us as well, how should we do this? So we thought we should make something and like show. And even actually yesterday when we're mentioning this, so I did a study with USCORDA and I did this one from cradle to grave. And then there's been a new like standard that's being developed in Sweden for retailers, and it's being made for cradle to gate only. So they were asking me, how can we take your LCA and use it to be able to use this standard? So, and one thing that I actually research a lot about is this, like, we call it the technopolitics of LCA and how it's being used by industry and like because people have their own way and they want to use it in their own way. So it's not only about like how it's being used, but also the numbers and the legitimacy behind it. So you really need to think about it.
That takes you back then to that slide you showed of the bag salad with the numbers on it. Did it impact sales at all?
Sorry, what did you say?
So you showed a slide with the bag salad and comments on sustainability on it. Did that impact sales in any way? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
I mean, it's because it's can a premium be generated, or does it just give a cozy, warm feeling to people that are buying it that they're buying sustainables? I mean, kind of going onto that feature as well. One thing that had crossed my mind as you were talking was, are the base calculations that the LCAs are based on? So CO2 equivalents, for example, hydro or wind, are they always the same, or are they evolving as well? Your base unit conversion units, because as the energy generation systems become more efficient, you would think those figures should be moving as well.
Yeah, they definitely are improving, and that's what I mean with when you buy the databases, they improve,
Okay.
but they're usually lagging behind like a year or two. So like the latest version, EcoInvent 3.91, might have the data based on like 2020 figures, and there I think what I didn't really mention in one of the slides, I talked about the dynamic. So if you do a snapshot or if you do a dynamic assessment. So the thing is, your vertical farm might actually be better than the, if you take the snapshot, like if we talk about energy. So if you really model your system when you know you're using electricity, and for example, see like what is the capacity at that hour, your impacts might actually be lower than if you just use the average. So if you understand when you're using it and try and model it, then you could actually show that you have an improvement based on these generic data.
So you kind of showed something like that on the IKEA one, where if you're not, potentially there's no point using it in the summer because you're getting no benefit. So what did IKEA do? Did they shut them down, or did they use it to grow something else that you couldn't grow, or was it very expensive to import? Because basically, if you've got a vertical farm, the ability to pivot in them should be great.
Yeah. So that's a bad case. So they shut down the container farm, but it wasn't because of the numbers I provided. It was because like basically the economy and the war, and they had to drop all of their innovation programs at IKEA. So vertical farming was one of them. So they stopped all of their work with vertical farming. And I think that the container is still there in Malmö, that one, and you can buy it if you want. It's a nice one, yeah.
So
it's been sitting there for a year or two, and yeah.
They might accept the cheaper offer then. So let's get one final one before you go there. So Catherine, do you want to give the last question then?
Yeah, it was again. It's a slightly loaded question. It has come to do with dealing with fish farm assessments. If there's poor data and you're therefore relying on averages, how do you incentivize people, if they're going to be assessed on this, to give you good data, particularly in areas where they might feel they're performing badly and therefore the averages would look flattering to them?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and oftentimes what we do in the LCAs, maybe it's controversial, is so the average data might be bad, and then what we'll tell them is they'll say we don't have data for this, and then we use the average data, and then we show them the impact, and we say, oh wow, your impact is quite large for this process when we're using this data, and then that might give them an incentive to look further into their data, and they say, oh no, but we're better than that. We use something else, and then they'll actually do it. And
yeah, I think maybe a bit more the other way around. You know, you said in Sweden you've got average data for electricity, but up north that's more renewables. Down south it's less so. So if they're sited down south, then using average data might be better for them.
Yeah, and that's where what I typically like to do. So in all of the articles that I publish, I use the average data as the baseline, and then I use their for example, their certificates as the comparative analysis, and then they can use that data if they want for their own reports, but I don't want to publish the data with their certificates, the numbers that they say that they buy, based on because when you ask any company, they always say they buy renewable energy. And what we talk about in LCA is that if you add up all of the renewable energy that everyone says they buy, it's more than that's being produced. So it's never accurate. And then, so we try to be a bit more, what would you call it? Like, yeah, conventional in that sense, just to show the baseline data.
So there's kind of a role for a need for LCA validation dependency.
Yeah.
I mean, going back to kind of what Catherine was saying, kind of Francis and I have discussed this about when you're working with companies, the more you accrue that data to create the spread, and this is a kind of incentivization thing. If you give the data to us that we need, we can tell you where you are on the spread, but only you will know where you are. But you'll know what the industry spread is. So it's, you redact the wider data, but you can tell them exactly where they sit. Now, if they're sitting at the top, they might want to broadcast that, but if they're sitting at the bottom, they definitely won't. But it gives them a feel for where they want to get to, or down the way, I suppose, if your emissions. And kind of that operates as an almost win-win approach to the system, but it's a slow burn process, I think.
But then they can also like think about ways that they can improve.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Closer, yeah, so
that's fine. Okay, I realise we've grilled you for a long time now, Michael. So I'd just like to thank you for giving your talk today. It's been useful for everyone. The talk will be put up on the APGC YouTube site, so you can watch it again and again. Michael's contact details are there, and we will definitely be in contact again. So if we just show your appreciation in the normal ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me as well.
It's cool. We'll have to have you over here when we are opening the new system. So it'd be good to have you over. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you again.
Have a great weekend, everyone, too.
Bye.
Great Easter. Yeah. Bye-bye.